Before continuing, please note in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. This kind of detail always helps to understand how old stories still transcend time. Some records never disappear. They just lie silent for decades, waiting for someone to carefully leaf through them again. Among yellowed papers, hastily written notes, and interrupted testimonies, there is a case from the late 19th century that remains one of those unsolved stories. Not because there is a lack of documentation, but because what happened in the minutes before the disappearance never seemed important, until it was too late. The archives of Ridgeway County, a small rural community nestled between dirt roads, newly installed railroad tracks, and densely vegetated hills, record what happened in the winter of 1897. At the time, Ridgeway was nothing more than a passing point. A few dozen wooden houses, a general store, a simple church, and families who knew each other by name, surname, and inherited stories. Nothing there suggested that the place would enter the records of unexplained disappearances in the region. The protagonist of this story is Elias Morton, 32 years old, a farmer, married, father of 2 young children. His name appears on tax lists, baptism records, and in a brief note in the local sheriff's notebook. Elias was described as an ordinary man, one of those who leave no obvious mark on the collective memory. He worked the land, waking before dawn and returning at dusk with his boots covered in dried mud. There was no history of conflict, known deaths, or involvement in family disputes, at least not in official documents. The Morton house was just over a kilometer from the village center, near a line of trees that marked the beginning of the dense forest. It was a simple but well-kept building, with clear signs of a stable routine. Stacked firewood, organized tools, clothes hanging on the clothesline even on cold days. Later testimonies described the environment as too quiet to attract attention. Reports about Elias speak of a reserved but present man. He was not given to long conversations in the store and did not usually stay after Sunday services. Still, he was seen as reliable. When he needed to be away for a few hours, he would let people know. When he came back late, he would leave signs. Nothing in his conduct suggested a break, escape, or deliberate abandonment. The winter that year had been harsher than usual. Weather records indicate below-average temperatures and long, silent nights when the most constant sound came from the wind blowing through the cracks in the houses. The community retired early. Lanterns were extinguished before 8 o'clock. The roads were empty. It was a time when any unusual movement stood out, and yet no one noticed anything that day. According to the documents, Elias was last seen in the late afternoon. There was no recorded argument, no apparent rush. A neighbor mentioned greeting him from a distance. Another said he saw the door of the house closed as usual. Everything seemed in line with the normality of that time and place. But upon reviewing the records carefully, a detail begins to repeat itself discreetly. Small marginal notes, incomplete sentences in statements, a poorly explained time gap between simple actions. Nothing dramatic, nothing that in isolation would arouse suspicion. Still, when the documents are placed side by side, an uncomfortable gap emerges. Something was done moments before Elias Morton's disappearance. Something trivial enough not to be questioned. Something that, decades later, would come to be seen as the exact point at which everything changed. And it is precisely this detail, ignored at the time, underestimated by the first investigators, that makes this case one of the most disturbing historical records in the region. Because it was not the night, nor the road, nor the forest that started the mystery. It was a decision made in silence, recorded only between the lines of the archives. In the following documents, this choice appears for the last time, and with it, the trail of Elias Morton simply ends. To understand what was lost that night, one must first understand what existed before it. The oldest records of Elias Morton's routine speak not of mystery, but of repetition. Predictable, almost interchangeable days. As was common in rural communities at the end of the 19th century, life in Ridgeway was organized around natural schedules. Sunrise, the ringing of the church bell, the closing of the store at dusk. Elias always woke up before full light. One of the most detailed accounts, given years later by a former neighbor, describes the constant sound of the wooden door opening just before dawn. There was a cadence to it, a recognizable pattern. Coffee was quickly prepared. The children were still asleep. His wife remained in the kitchen, tending the low fire. Nothing in the accounts suggests tension within the home. On the contrary, the descriptions speak of a quiet, functional coexistence, typical of marriages formed more out of necessity and partnership than public displays of affection. Elias's work did not require long commutes. His lands were close to his home, and the boundaries were known to everyone around. He did not usually cross the forest without reason. The forest began where the safe routine of the village ended, a respected space, rarely explored after nightfall. Still, records indicate that Elias knew those trails well, occasionally using them to shorten his commute during the day. The documents also reveal small, silent tensions, nothing that would have attracted attention at the time. An occasional delay in returning home, an isolated comment about sleepless nights, a note from the store indicating that Elias had started buying certain items more frequently in the weeks before his disappearance. All of this was considered irrelevant by the initial investigators, just signs of a routine slightly altered by the harsh winter. Testimonies collected years later helped to reconstruct the emotional climate of that period. One resident described Elias as quieter than usual. Another mentioned that he seemed to avoid long conversations, responding only when necessary. There were no public fights or formal complaints, but there is a curious convergence in the reports, the feeling that Elias was aware of something that others did not perceive. The Morton family had no history that would justify concern on the part of the authorities. There were no recorded land disputes or documented threats. The absence of conflict made the case, at first glance, too simple. When someone disappeared at that time, there was almost always an apparent reason. Escape, violence, accident. In Elias's case, none of these hypotheses fully held up. One recurring detail in the records only draws attention when analyzed as a whole: the time of day. Several testimonies refer to dusk. Not late at night, nor early morning, but that short interval when the light begins to fade and activities have not yet ceased completely. A period when small decisions are often made without prolonged reflection. In a note preserved in the county archives, the clerk records that Elias was seen performing ordinary tasks with no signs of urgency. This phrase appears almost identically in more than one document. It is as if those responsible wanted to reinforce that nothing was out of place. And precisely for this reason, no one asked any questions. Years later, his children would remember a seemingly ordinary day. There were no prolonged goodbyes, no unusual promises, no words that could be interpreted as an omen. The normality was so absolute that it became invisible. But later testimonies, collected decades later, begin to reveal something different. Some people remembered a specific gesture, a simple, almost automatic movement repeated by Elias that afternoon, a habit that, until then, had never been questioned. In the archives, this gesture is described in vague terms, always as part of a routine sequence. Nothing alarming, nothing noteworthy. Still, when comparing schedules, reports, and distances, it becomes clear that this small act definitively altered the timeline of that night. And this is where the story begins to narrow, because everything Elias did before that was recorded, commented on, and remembered. Everything that came after simply does not exist. The next document takes us to the exact moment when the routine breaks, not with a bang, nor with violence, but with a seemingly harmless choice made in the final minutes of an ordinary day. The records dealing with Elias Morton's last night are scarce, but not empty. They do not describe an abrupt event or a moment of clear rupture. On the contrary, everything we know points to a slow, almost imperceptible sequence of small decisions, the kind that are rarely remembered because they seem to carry no weight. That afternoon, the sky over Ridgeway was low and opaque. It wasn't raining, but the air carried the humidity typical of days when the cold approaches without warning. The sun disappeared early behind the hills, plunging the village into a bluish twilight that made the outlines of the houses less defined. Lanterns began to be lit one by one. Doors closed. The sound of the world diminished. According to the last confirmed statement, Elias was seen walking toward the northern edge of his property shortly after sunset. He was not carrying any large tools or supplies, only what was necessary for a short trip. A neighbor, questioned years later, stated that no words were exchanged, just a distant, almost automatic wave. Nothing in that gesture suggested a farewell. The detail most often cited in the documents is the path he chose. Instead of the main trail, well marked and visible even in low light, Elias opted for a narrower side path that crossed an initial stretch of forest. It was a shortcut, used occasionally during the day, known to some older residents. It was neither dangerous nor prohibited, just less used after dark. The sound described in the reports is always the same. The light wind in the dry leaves, the distant creaking of some wooden structure, the silence interspersed with footsteps receding into the distance. There is no mention of screams or cries for help. No witness reported hearing anything out of the ordinary that night. The reconstruction made by investigators suggests that Elias entered the woods a few minutes after he was last seen. The light was already low, but sufficient for someone familiar with the terrain to find their way. He had taken that route before. There was no immediate reason for concern. The exact point where the trail disappears is mentioned in more than one document. A stretch where the ground changes, becoming softer, covered with old leaves and broken branches. There, the footsteps are no longer easily traceable. From that point on, all we have are hypotheses based on incomplete marks found days later. Interrupted footprints, a broken branch, signs that led nowhere. The weather that night made the situation worse. Weather records indicate a sharp drop in temperature and stronger winds after dark. This would have quickly erased any recent traces. When the search began, there was no longer enough continuity to accurately reconstruct the route. One of the most disturbing details emerges in a report written weeks later. None of Elias's personal belongings were found. No hat, no tools, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had been swallowed up by the space between two known points, his home and the start of the trail. Investigators tried to establish a strict timeline. They cross-referenced times, calculated distances, and estimated the time needed to cover each section. Everything indicated that Elias should have returned in less than an hour. When that didn't happen, his absence was only noticed too late. The house remained silent. The night wore on. Normality lasted a few hours longer than it should have. The last concrete evidence associated with Elias Morton appears in an almost bureaucratic record. A note that a lamp was found extinguished near the edge of the property days later. It is not certain that it belonged to him. There were no identifiable marks. Still, the object came to be cited as the last physical link between Elias and the known world. Nothing else has been confirmed. No body, no clear sign of an accident, no evidence of violence. Just the void left by a man who made a simple decision. To choose a slightly different path at an unusual time. And it is precisely in this interval, between the ordinary gesture and the absolute absence, that the mystery consolidates. Because everything Elias did up to that point is understandable, documented, human. But what happened after that specific point on the trail could never be reconstructed. The next record no longer speaks of Elias on the move, but of the consequences of his absence, and how the silence of that night began to spread throughout the entire community. Elias Morton's absence was only noticed the next morning. There was no immediate alarm, no rush. In Ridgeway, delays happened. Men spent the night away for simple reasons. A lost animal, a fallen fence, a favor done for a neighbor. The initial silence was not interpreted as a threat, but as a variation from the routine. It was only when the sun was high and the house remained closed that Elias's wife sought help. The first to arrive found no signs of violence. The bed was intact. The kitchen was tidy. Nothing was out of place. The only thing missing was the man himself. This seemingly simple detail would make the case more difficult to understand. The search began in an improvised manner. Neighbors walked familiar trails, called out his name, and retraced the paths Elias usually took. The forest returned only the echo of their voices and the muffled sound of footsteps on damp leaves. There was no uncontrolled rush, not yet. The prevailing idea was that he would be found somewhere nearby, perhaps injured, perhaps disoriented. It was only on the third day that the sheriff was formally involved. Records show a cautious, almost hesitant investigation. There was no clear evidence to justify broader measures. Still, some details began to bother them. The time that had passed since his disappearance, the total absence of personal belongings, the lack of any witnesses who had seen Elias after sunset. Statements were meticulously collected. Each neighbor repeated similar versions, nothing out of the ordinary, no strange behavior, no arguments. But when asked about that specific afternoon, an unexpected convergence emerged. Several people mentioned, almost in passing, that Elias didn't usually go out at that time. The phrase appears repeatedly in different documents, always without emphasis, as if no one had realized its importance at the time. The search went on for weeks. Groups advanced through the woods beyond the initial stretch of the trail. They found old marks, impossible to date accurately. Some believed they had seen signs of slips. Others claimed that there was nothing to indicate an accident. None of these clues were definitively substantiated. As time passed, the official narrative began to take shape. There was talk of disorientation, accidental falls, hypothermia, plausible hypotheses compatible with the climate and the region. Still, none explained the complete absence of traces. None justified why Elias would have strayed so far without carrying anything with him. It is in the later records, personal letters, memoirs written decades later, that the most human and disturbing revelation of the case emerges. A former resident mentions that Elias had commented days earlier about resolving something quickly before dark. The phrase was not questioned at the time. It did not seem important, but it appears in isolation as the only indication of conscious intent. Another note, found in a notebook that was not part of the official files, suggests that Elias may have chosen the shortcut because he believed it would save him a few minutes. Nothing more than that. No elaborate plan, no extreme urgency, just the conviction that this route was sufficient for a quick trip. The revelation is not a grand event, nor a shocking truth. It is something minor, almost frustrating. Elias disappeared because he trusted normality too much, because he believed that repeating a habit at a slightly different time would have no consequences, because he underestimated the weight of small decisions made at the end of the day. Over time, the investigation was closed. The case remained open only in the records. The community returned to its routine. The Morton house was occupied by other families. The trail continued to exist, now avoided at dusk, without anyone being able to explain exactly why. Elias's disappearance did not generate immediate collective mourning. It generated silence. An uncomfortable silence that infiltrated conversations and discreetly altered local habits. And it is from this prolonged silence, more than from any concrete evidence, that the case stands out as one of the most disturbing in the region, because there was no obvious crime. There were no culprits, only the belated realization that what was done moments before the disappearance was exactly what made everything irreversible. Decades later, when the Ridgeway County archives were reorganized, the name Elias Morton reappeared as so many others do, among box numbers, imprecise dates, and notes made by different hands. The researcher who gathered these documents wrote little. He limited himself to sorting the papers, comparing schedules, and underlining repetitions. He was not looking for a definitive conclusion. He sought to understand what time had erased without realizing it. Upon rereading the testimonies, the absence of dramatization is striking. No one described panic. No one spoke of omens. Elias' disappearance was absorbed into everyday life, like a brief noise that, over the years, becomes part of the background. The village continued to exist. The children grew up. The harvests followed their cycle. The case remained an unresolved interlude, and nothing more. The historian noted that the most accurate accounts did not come from the authorities but from the margins. Personal letters, memoirs written for children and grandchildren, comments jotted down with no intention of official record. In these texts, Elias's name always appears associated with the same theme: time. Not chronological time, but felt time, the exact moment when one still believes there is control. There is a curious recurrence in the language. Before dark, just a few minutes, right there. Small expressions used by people who cannot imagine that the world can close between one step and another. The researcher noted that these phrases appear frequently in similar cases, scattered across different regions and distant years, not as a warning, but as a human pattern. With historical distance, it becomes possible to see that the disappearance of Elias Morton did not only alter an individual destiny, it altered behaviors. Trails began to be avoided at certain times. Shortcuts were no longer used. Simple decisions began to be postponed until the next morning. None of this was imposed by law or explicit fear. It was assimilated by custom. The house where Elias lived was renovated, then demolished. The line of trees advanced a few meters. The trail still exists, although it is almost invisible under layers of leaves accumulated over more than a century. Those who pass by find no marks, no signs, no material memories, just a stretch of land that does not invite haste. The historian ends his notes with a discreet observation. The case is not remembered for what happened, but for what did not happen. There was no scream, there was no struggle, there was no farewell. There was only the interrupted continuity of an ordinary day. And sometimes that is what is most disturbing, the idea that the extraordinary does not announce itself. At the end of his analysis, he writes that there is no way to say where Elias Morton ended up that night. What can be said, based on the records, is where he was minutes before, and how, in that brief interval, he trusted that nothing would change. Time did the rest. Some stories remain open not because they lack answers, but because they reveal something uncomfortable about the way silence operates between small decisions and definitive consequences. And when the files are closed and the office lights are turned off, all that remains is the awareness that certain disappearances do not happen in the dark. They happen in plain sight, while the day still seems safe.